Hello everyone, welcome to this PVsyst presentation. Today I will be explaining how to use PVsyst to simulate PV installations with battery energy storage system and how to use different power dispatching strategies. So let me start by giving you a bit of a context. The rising PV penetration is leading to new constraints and price dynamics. In some places there can be a heavy grid curtailment. Other location might have negative prices occurring during peak production hours, and there can be restrictions on new installations. And finally, there can be some changes in the power purchase agreements. Because of all of these reasons, battery energy storage systems are becoming more and more necessary. They can help you to keep curtailed energy or shift a larger fraction of your production to higher load hours. And they are now enabled by the drastic price reduction that we've seen in the recent years. So the question I'll be tackling today is how to design a BESS in PVsyst to adapt to the new market constraints. So let's start with an overview of PVsyst storage tools. Here I'll be focusing only on our grid-connected system. So our storage tool is available in the main parameter windows of PVsyst, and it gives you 4 different storage strategies. So the first one is the self-consumption strategy. It's meant for a home to commercial size system to store your production for self-consumption. Then we have the weak grid strategy that is meant for places in the world where the grid can be unstable. And here the main purpose of your battery is really to function as backup power. Then we also have our peak shaving strategy. So here it's in a system that undergoes grid curtailment. The idea is to store the excess of PV production above the grid curtailment limit to inject it later into the grid. So this option has been available in PVsyst 8.0 with a fixed grid limit, and in the upcoming PVsyst 8.1 version, you'll be able to import custom hourly values for the grid curtailment limit. And finally, we have a new storage strategy called power shifting that was introduced in PVsyst 8.0.17. It's similar to peak shaving, but here it operates independently of a grid curtailment limit. Here you will store a much larger fraction of your production to again inject it into the grid later in the day. In this presentation today, I'll be focusing on the 2 last strategies, peak shaving and power shifting. Now let's dive into the details of PVsyst power shifting tool. So here on the right, you can see the layout of the tool. This window allows you to define the charging and discharging strategy for your tool. So on the charging side, you have 3 options that you can use. The first option lets you define the amount of power you want to send to the grid first, and you will charge the battery with whatever is remaining. You can also do the opposite and first charge a certain power into your battery and inject the remaining energy into the grid. And finally, you can choose to just define a fraction of the energy that will go to your battery, the rest again going to the grid. For discharging, it's a bit simpler. You have just a fixed amount of power that will be discharged at the time you choose. And now for the choice of the time of charging and discharging, you have a lot of flexibility since you can define time zones with a 30-minute granularity. So in the current version of the tool, you can only define 1 fixed yearly strategy, but in the upcoming 8.1 version of PVsyst, we'll have an upgrade to this tool that allows you to input charge and discharge profiles from a CSV file. And that's a really interesting option since it allows you to use an external algorithm to optimize the way you want to operate your battery based on whatever data you want, such as weather forecast or price forecast. All right, that's enough for the theory. Now let's dive into a use case example. So here I'll be looking at 4 different BESS scenarios with a given system. My first scenario has no storage whatsoever, and a heavy curtailment. Well, that will be my reference system. Then I'll have 3 systems with BESS. So the first one is with a peak shaving strategy, where I will just store the excess energy above a grid limit. Then I have a second scenario with what I call the simple power shifting. Here I'm using the power shifting from PVsyst 8.0, and I have a discharge fixed at the peak hour. Finally, my last scenario will use the optimized power shifting with the tools that will be available in PVsyst 8.1, and I have defined per day custom charge and discharge profile. The PV system I'm using here is simply our commercial rooftop demo. As a reminder, it's a system on a rooftop with a fixed tilt and about 500 kilowatt peak of PV installed. And I'll be using it with a grid curtailment limit at 300 kilowatt AC. Finally, when I look at the electricity sale, I will be using real market data from the EU Transparency platform. And I'll be looking at 4 different locations: Switzerland, Germany, Sicily, and Spain. And I'll analyze the data for 2020 to 2023. Now, let's take some time to look into more details about how this optimized charge and discharge works. So here I'll be presenting the workflow for this new option. So it goes in several steps. In my first step, I've defined a simulation of my system with no storage, and from that I'm getting the expected AC production. As input, I'm using a weather time series instead of a TMY. I'll be combining this data with the expected price, and from these 2 inputs, I'll use an external optimization algorithm to compute how I want to charge and discharge my battery. So there's many different algorithms you can use, and you could use more data than these 2 inputs. But here, this is just a simple example. And my algorithm will do 2 things. It will guarantee that there is no curtailment losses, and then it will try to fully charge the battery every day when the price is the lowest, and then discharge it during the highest price of the day. So that's the charge and discharge profiles that I'm getting from this algorithm. And from there, I obtain a CSV file that I will input back into PVsyst. And I'll run a second simulation, this time with power shifting. And from that, I will get the final amount of energy that I'm able to inject into the grid. All right, now that you know everything about the 3 strategies that I am using, let's look at the results. So here I'll be looking at the sales gain, so comparing the revenues from the different BESS scenarios versus the no storage scenario. So the good news is obviously that all BESS scenarios are performing better in all markets. Now, if I look first at the peak shaving strategy, so that's the strategy with the lowest battery, the revenues vary greatly from one year to the next and from one location to another. The highest revenue gains that I have reach almost 30,000 euros for Sicily in 2022. And the lowest being in Germany in 2020, where I barely reach 2,000 euros of gain. Here, if you wonder why the prices are so high in 2022, it's due to the very high increase in electricity prices due to the war in Ukraine. Now, if I move on to the simple power shifting strategy, here I already have quite a bit of an increase in the overall gains. So here in my example for Sicily in 2022, I have reached almost 40,000 euros. And in Germany in 2020, I also have a bit of an increase to, let's say, 4,000 euros. What's also interesting to note here is that the amount of gain that you have depends not only on the mean electricity price, but also on the daily price spread. And finally, in my last scenario, the optimized power shifting, I have even a larger electricity sales gain. I've reached almost 50,000 euro in Sicily in 2022. And even for a scenario in Germany, I have huge increases as well, reaching up to a 6-time increase compared to peak shaving. And that increase can be explained by the large amount of negative prices that can occur in Germany. Now, the gains are great, but is it all worth it? Of course, to answer that question, you really have to look into the details of the battery costs. And we do have a tool in PVsyst to do that. It's called the economic evaluation. And in that tool, you can input the detailed price of your components, as well as the maintenance and operation costs. Here, I'm just going to give you an order of magnitude estimate, and I'll only use the price for a battery pack from the IEA survey of 2023. So if I look at the return on investment on my battery here, it varies greatly from one location to the next. The lowest return on investment I have here are for peak shaving scenarios in Switzerland and Germany. That shows you that the system I've tried to implement is not really worth building, and in that specific case, it's my battery that has been oversized. But in some other locations, my system seems to be functioning great. That's the case especially for Sicily and Spain. The returns on investments are reasonably similar if I look at both scenarios, but the power shifting one seems slightly higher. However, there's one more piece of information I really need to look into before taking any decision. It's the battery degradation. And in PVsyst, you can have a look at the number of battery cycles or state of wear. And here, if I take this data into account, it paints a bit of a different picture. If I compare the number of cycles for peak shaving, that is down to 52 cycles in 1 year for Sicily, and up to 275 cycles in Spain for the power shifting strategy, well, I get a rather different conclusion, since my battery, in the case of power shifting, can degrade just much faster. So the conclusion of this is that really there's no single strategy that will work for any place or any system, but you really have to check for each location the best choice, the operation strategy, and take into account battery degradation. As a conclusion, today I've shown you PVsyst tools for modeling and comparing PV system plus BESS projects. As a reminder, I focused on two of our tools, the peak shaving option that allows you to store excess production above a given curtailment limit, and I've presented the power shifting tool that allows you to shift a larger proportion of your energy to inject it into the grid at peak demand time. Both tools are available in the current PVsyst version, and both will also see some improvements in the upcoming 8.1 version, with the option to customize them for hourly values through a CSV file. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact PVsyst support at support@pvsyst.com.